Bering Straits in the east, and then kind of down to the Liao River, kind of in the border between China proper and Manchuria. So we'll be covering kind of Korea, Japan, Mongolia, and a lot of Siberian stuff as well. So let's just start off way back in the beginning, the last ice age. Well, I guess we should discuss methods first. So a lot of what we know about the past, we rely on linguistics. We can, look at the comparative method, the languages that are related, kind of vocabulary they share. We can tell from certain words, like if two languages are related to each other, but they have a different word for iron, that would show that they split off at some point before ironworking was developed. Similarly, there's different grammatical techniques you can use to see if languages influenced each other. All sorts of very interesting stuff linguists do. You can also look for borrowed words. If all the languages have a similar word like computer, you can tell that they all got computer from the same source, and didn't invent it independently. Another thing that we can use is ancient DNA. There's been several thousand now ancient skeletons that have been DNA tested, and we can get quite a bit of information out of them, just who's related to who, and kind of the three main things in ancient DNA that we look at are the Y chromosomes, which are passed down father to son without any changes. Well, sometimes there are some changes, and those are the changes that are kind of rare, and we look to kind of provide a scaffolding for male-mediated migrations. That's kind of a fancy way of saying that a group of men set up a war band and, conquered an area like Cortez conquered Mexico, or, that kind of thing. We can also look at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from a mother to all of her children, and we can see that for kind of female migrations. And lastly, we can look at autosomal DNA, which is kind of the DNA that recombines every generation. We look at kind of unique mutations or frequencies of certain alleles in there to get an idea, roughly how much ancestry does each group get from a, mother or father group at some point in the past. That method has some difficulties too. There's issues. There's some ancient skeletons, some ancient DNA samples, I should say. They're not always skeletons necessarily. That, they're not high resolution. They get kind of bad information from them. And as a result, those kind of results tend to be controversial. Another thing we can use is archaeology. It's very, very important. We look at kind of the pots that different groups have, since those tend to preserve well. Metal tools and burials, the way that people are buried. There's sometimes, just kind of the way the bodies are arranged, what they're buried with. Sometimes people are buried with their servants or, wives, that kind of thing. So you can kind of tell cultural changes that way too. Also historical records, sometimes places that were prehistoric, they didn't have a written language necessarily, were recorded by other societies. That's certainly the case for a lot of East Asia once we get after 1000 BC, where a lot of these peoples were probably recorded by the classical Chinese, even if their specific identities are controversial. And, of course, as we get even closer to the historical period, we can, look at some of these surviving peoples and where they're at and see that they have kind of a cultural continuity with their ancestors and have kind of a decent idea that, hey, this is who's been there for a very, very long time. Radiocarbon dating, also very useful for a lot of archaeological sites. You can get dates within a couple hundred years. So again, kind of very useful for providing a scaffolding. So kind of prehistory, it's a very multidisciplinary field. You use all these different methods to kind of combine to get a picture for what actually happened. A lot of this stuff, very fast-moving field, particularly in northeastern Asia and really East Asia in general. The Chinese are churning out papers. constantly. So our understanding of a lot of this stuff is undoubtedly going to change in the next couple of years. And that's kind of why I focused more on Northeast Asia specifically, since it's, better understood than Asia. So let's go back to the very beginning, the Ice Age. So there's a couple main groups that are wandering around about 20,000, 25,000 BC. We have the ancestral North Eurasians. They kind of lived in the area from, what's modern day East Turkestan, Xinjiang, in Western China into central, kind of North Central Asia, modern day Kazakhstan, in Western China into central, kind of North Central Asia, modern day Kazakhstan. They also kind of ranged all the way up to Lake Baikal, the Yenisei River, Krasnoyarsk, in Russia. And they did have some contacts with the peoples of Japan, the Jomon, that are kind of mysterious. Now, the Jomon themselves were kind of another one of the main, broad groups, ancestry groups, I should say, not necessarily cultural. A lot of these were very small bands. They were all over what's nowadays East Asia. They ruled Japan, they ruled Korea. They were all the way down into Guangxi province of China. They were in the Shandong Peninsula of China. And most likely, they were all kind of connected by what are now the drowned lands of, the Yellow Sea. The Yellow Sea actually used to be a plain way back 20,000 years ago. It did not always used to be a sea. Actually, like a lot of what's nowadays the coast off of China used to be land. And it was kind of a barren area. As far as we can tell, it was extremely cold. I mean, it was the Ice Age after all, barren plains. So most likely these would have been kind of isolated coastal groups that lived off of farming. And indeed, the vocabulary that we have that might have survived in certain languages, like the Nif language of, kind of the area around Vladivostok in eastern Russia, looks like it was specifically from, words related to fishing and various things related to the sea, that survive within that language from these, ancient Jomon and Jomon-like people. So, that's kind of like the Jomon area. And then you have the, ancestors of what we consider like the East Asians, the, Asian race, like what we would recognize as that today, even though way back in the past, they were, of course, a lot more diverse, just like everyone was. Because again, these are very xenophobic, like small, hunter-gatherer tribes wandering around there, just like they were everywhere. Where they lived, pretty mysterious. My guess personally is those, deserts and steppes, kind of separated them from the Jomon. They might have been like an interior people, whereas like the Jomon peoples would have been more coastal. And again, that's just a guess, could be completely wrong. I'm just going based off of, the evidence we have for the Jomon is they're very much a, maritime type people everywhere that we found them, and they're kind. So those are kind of the main three groups. Now, they weren't static by any means. The, kind of East Asian-like peoples, they actually managed to migrate north into eastern Siberia, maybe about 20,000 years ago. And they're kind of pressing into the ancestral North Eurasian territory. And the ancestral North Eurasians actually go and they take them over. Their descendants, the Amerindians, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, they go and, all their Y haplogroups, their male line ancestry is, haplogroups related to, or descended from, I should say, the ancestral North Eurasians. It's like haplogroup Q, haplogroup R. It's not like haplogroup N or haplogroup O, which tend to be associated with the East Asian peoples, and it's definitely not the haplogroup D, which is associated with the Jomon peoples. So we know these ancestral North Eurasians, they took over the, these East Asian peoples that are migrating north. They kind of forged together maybe about 20,000 to 18,000 BC. And, some of them settle in Beringia, which is the land bridge a couple thousand years later, and eventually, cross into the Americas. There's some arguments that there's some similarities between the Nifk language and some of the languages of the northwestern Americas. Edward Vida, he's kind of made some arguments about that. Great scholar. If you're really interested in doing deep dives in this stuff, I strongly recommend you check him out. His last name is Vajda. A very smart guy. I've gotten a lot from him. Now, these kind of Amerindian-like peoples, they kind of wandered around a lot of eastern Siberia for thousands and thousands of years, actually. It wasn't until, much later that they were actually destroyed by the ancestors of, what we know today as the Dene Yenaseans. About 15 years ago, Edward Vida, he went and he proved pretty conclusively with the evidence that linguists accept with the comparative method, that a people called the Ket, who live in central Siberia, are their language is related to the Navajo language of kind of northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, here in the United States. And what genetics has shown is they actually do share a lot of ancestry. I think it's about 8% for the Navajo. Comes from this group that crossed the Bering Strait much later than the normal kind of Amerindian peoples. And that's why you have this similarity between the Ket language and the Navajo language. Now, this kind of group of people, the Dene Yenaseans, and the Yenisei, that's a river in Siberia that the Ket live near. And Dene is the word for people in the Navajo language. That's what they call themselves. Way back in the day, they were pretty intensely xenophobic and didn't consider anyone else to be truly human. Although that kind of changed after they kind of took over a lot of stuff, but that's for a different time. So you have this kind of expansion of these Dene Yenasean peoples as they're going and kind of conquering what's modern day northeastern Siberia. And that would have been, probably about 8,000 to 6,000 BC when they go and launch their kind of campaigns of conquest. Now, the Dene Yenaseans, they too had been forged from a mixture of, those kind of East Asian peoples, as well as the ancestral North Eurasians. They too went and, were kind of a group of ancestral North Eurasians that installed themselves upon a considerably larger group of East Asian people. They also had a haplogroup Q. I think they were something like 80% East Asian, and then, 20% East Asian and 80% ancestral North Eurasian in ancestry. So they're pretty distinctive. You can tell them from, when they migrate to the Americas, they go, and that's about 2800 BC to 2500 BC. They actually go, and they're pretty distinctive. They show up as the Sakak sample, and I know I'm mispronouncing that wrong. It's SAQQAQ. Once they kind of migrate into what's modern day northern Canada. So at the same time, there'd been a bunch of other convulsions going on. You do have at some point towards the end of the last ice age, this renewed migration of East Asian people into Mongolia, into Manchuria, and into kind of the Lake Baikal area. And the migration, either diffuses because some of this ancestry reaches all the way into kind of northern Kazakhstan as well as western Siberia. The peoples of western Siberia, they were maybe 20% East Asian by about 6000 BC. And the peoples of kind of northern Kazakhstan, the Botai people, they were maybe 50%. There was definitely considerable migrations out of, kind of Manchuria, northern China area, Yellow River maybe, towards the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Holocene. Holocene's the last 10,000 years pretty much. when humans started really expanding and conquering a lot more ecologies. Um, Now, that being said, like, definitely a lot of churn and stuff. There was kind of an ancestral North Eurasian revival that was taking place from the 6th to the 3rd millenniums BC. You have the bow tie people. The bow tie people were probably the first ones to domesticate the horse, even before the Indo-Europeans, although I think they did it with Przewalski's horse. Kind of used them for food more than they did for riding, which proved to be a disastrous mistake. Um, and those people actually went and they took over Khakassia. They became the Akunevo culture about 2500 to 2000 BC. And that wasn't kind of the only ancestral North Eurasian revival. You have kind of this growth where, the peoples of Lake Baikal in 6000 BC, they had been like 95% East Asian in ancestry and only like 5% ancestral North Eurasian in ancestry. But by 4000, 3000 BC, they were about 20% ancestral North Eurasian in ancestry and 80% East Asian in ancestry. And they kind of ruled the area, northern Mongolia, kind of the Lake Baikal area. And it was very separate from, Eastern Mongolia, which was very much part of the Manchurian world and remained pretty much 100% East Asian. And Western Mongolia, on the other hand, was much more exposed to the expanding steppe peoples from, what's modern days Ukraine and Russia, or southern Russia, I should say. Kind of the area around like Volgograd, Voronezh, Donetsk, Kharkov, kind of that whole area. There's this group of people called the Indo-Europeans, and one particular group of them, called the Taharians, went and migrated around 3000 BC all the way to Western Mongolia. And what kind of migration it was is difficult to say. They didn't really leave that much of a genetic impact anywhere. If anything, it looks like they just kind of migrated, they mixed with the locals and gradually got absorbed by them. Although not before they managed to spread their language to what's the modern day Tarim Basin. The peoples of, kind of modern day Xinjiang, specifically the southern part of it outside of Zhungaria, you have all these kind of oasis settlements, and they actually, those oasis settlements all the way until kind of the late first millennium AD, they spoke a very divergent Indo-European language called Taharian. That's most likely the language of that kind of early Indo-European group that crossed all the way to Western Mongolia. Now, the Taharians didn't actually leave any ancestry, and by Taharians, I mean kind of like the original, Indo-European Taharians. They actually did not leave any ancestry at all. In those, the historical Taharians of the Tarim Basin, who were like 80% ancestral North Eurasian and 20% kind of East Asian in ancestry. And, those kind of figures can be misleading because it was definitely a group that had been isolated for a very, very long time. They very much had their own look. Some of them clearly had fair skin, blonde hair, but, it's a mistake to think of them as kind of being a white people, since that kind of ancestry, I think the average person in Northern Europe would be something like 25% ancestral North Eurasian in ancestry. So just because people look like each other doesn't necessarily mean that they're related, and that's definitely true for the historical Taharians of the Tarim Basin. So further to the east, definitely a lot of momentous stuff going on. You have really all over the world, there's this development of agriculture. You have it in West Africa, you have it in the Fertile Crescent, you have it in Sri Lanka, New Guinea, and East Asia is no exception as well. You have millet is being cultivated in China proper, kind of the Yellow River area. Maybe 8300 to 6700 BC. It's kind of tricky for some of these radiocarbon dates due to, whenever you have water, there's all these microorganisms, there's fish, that kind of stuff that's always dying, and the organic material is kind of always floating down to the bottom. so as a result, it kind of messes with a lot of these radiocarbon dates for stuff that's by water. So millet farming, it spreads to the Liao River. That's kind of in southern Manchuria, close to the border with China proper. By the 57th century BC, you have the development of the Hongshan culture from 4700 BC to 2900 BC. Now we have some DNA from the Hongshan people, actually. And the interesting thing is they're actually mostly haplogroup N. Now, haplogroup N is kind of interesting because it's most commonly found in the Orlic-speaking peoples. The Orlic-speaking peoples are the Finns, the Hungarians, the Estonians in Europe, but their kind of linguistic and paternal origins are far, far to the east, all the way over in Manchuria. You have, the Finns and all them. The Hungarians migrated within the last 1,500 years to Europe. The Finns have been in Europe for maybe 3,000 years or so. During the Bronze Age collapse, they kind of crossed the Ural Mountains and overran what's nowadays Russia north of the forest line and kind of reached the Baltic. But their origins are actually very far to the east. When, at some point between, I talked about kind of that East Asian expansion, and the East Asian expansion would have been associated with people, with men specifically carrying the haplogroup N, at some point between 15,000 and 6,000 BC. And at some point before 6,000 BC, the paternal ancestors of the Orlic peoples had actually migrated west of Lake Baikal. We can tell that from genetic stuff, just kind of the divergences and everything. So they'd kind of diverged, roughly, and by roughly, I mean within the same couple of millennia as the ancestors of the Ndene people had. It's just the Orlics went west, most likely, to the Yenisei River, maybe a bit further north or west, whereas the ancestors of the Navajo, the Dene Yenaseans, we're kind of pushing up north. The ancestors of the Eskimos, like the Inuits and the Yukagirs, were kind of wandering around, and their story's a bit more complicated. So anyhow, you have this haplogroup N that's, very distinctive. And, the East Asian peoples, like we talked about earlier, they, were very diverse, had a lot of internal diversity. And the haplogroup N specifically was associated with kind of the East Asian peoples living in kind of northern Manchuria, whereas haplogroup O, which is most commonly found today in China, as well as Korea and Manchuria, that was, kind of the more southern branch, with the people of the Yellow River rather than the Amur River. The Amur River, the Black Dragon River, I think it's Heilongjiang in Chinese. That's the border that kind of separates Russia from China in Manchuria. Huge river, hugely important, a lot of marine resources there that presumably the ancestors of the Orlic peoples, as well as the paternal ancestors of the Hongshan people, came from. So anyhow, the Liao River, very, very important place. You have the contact of these, peoples migrating from the Amur, from kind of Manchuria, and they're coming in contact with the more sophisticated, more, population-dense peoples of the Yellow River. So they're kind of mixing in there, definitely favorable towards the Northerners. And that's where you go when you actually have the birth, perhaps around 6,000 to 5,000 BC, of what are called the Altaic languages. Now, Altaic languages, it's a controversial theory. I'm going heavily off of Martine Robeets here. She's fairly controversial. There's a lot of people who disagree with her. In the next couple of years, I think we'll get a better idea if she was right or wrong. The theory, though, is that Korean, Japanese, the Turkish languages, as well as the Tungusic languages, such as Manchu and Evenk, as well as Mongolian, are all related, going back thousands and thousands of years. And per Robeets' theory, all of those peoples, they descend from kind of a common linguistic ancestor that was specifically from this, Hongshan civilization in the Liao River way back, 5,000 BC or so. And as the theory goes, you have, all over the world, the adoption of agriculture, you have these massive population explosions, because rather than just being reliant on kind of the wildlife to feed yourself, all of a sudden you can cultivate fields, you can, man definitely controls his environment a great deal more with farming than he does when he's kind of left to the mercy of, wild animals and plant life and everything. So basically, the Altaic languages would have been associated with the spread of civilization. Now, that being said, it's, of course, a lot more complicated, since one of the issues with farming is that it actually created this kind of Neolithic health crisis everywhere. The peoples that are very reliant on grains, they don't get all the nutrients they need, and they shrink, they get shorter. They actually, in Europe, they evolved to get, shorter than their ancestors had been. I think it's something very similar in East Asia too, although, we'll definitely need more data to be sure. So anyhow, you have this Hongshan culture, and these agricultural people start to expand. You have them, push into Korea. You have them push into Manchuria. You have them push into Eastern Mongolia as well. Where was I going with this? That being said, the guys who pushed into Mongolia didn't go too far. The possibly Proto-Turkic speaking slab grave culture of Eastern Mongolia is actually haplogroup Q, not haplogroup N. It's kind of a weird story for them, because haplogroup Q, like we discussed earlier, it's a haplogroup associated with the ancestral North Eurasians. Even though, these guys, the slab grave culture, don't show really any other ancestry from the ancestral North Eurasians. So there's definitely cases of random guys getting isolated and totally absorbed in these tribes and not really leaving any trace other than their Y chromosome. Anyhow, it does support that at least that specific slab grave culture, might not have derived from this, Hongshan, the, Liao civilization people. Further to the east, it's a lot more clear-cut. The ancestors of the Tungusic peoples, the Evenks, and particularly the Manchus. The Manchus, they ruled China for several hundred years, from 1644 until 1911. I think there's still some people alive that might remember them. They migrated about 3500 BC from the Liao River. They brought their millet farming all the way over to Primoria, kind of the Vladivostok area. And from there, they kind of crept up the coast and, migrated to the north and to the west, even though some of them would eventually, of course, migrate back south several times, actually, within the historical period. I think there was actually another Chinese dynasty that, was of kind of Tungusic origin. So anyhow, let's see, what else was there? So, you go and you have, I'm sorry, let me just look back through my notes here. Okay, so we have, kind of the Jomon-like peoples. They're reigning in Korea, as well as Japan. You have the expansion of these Altaic peoples, the Mongols, Japanese, the Koreans, and the Tungusics, who are spreading out from this Liao River civilization. Further to the north, while all of this is happening, you have the ancestors of the Yukagir people, as well as the ancestors of, we know as the Eskimos. They go, and around the 23rd century BC, there's all these collapses everywhere. You have, the Langzhou civilization that's possibly related to the Polynesian peoples, like the Filipinos and the Samoans. They actually used to rule the Yenisei River, which is kind of the big river in China, to the south of the Yellow River. Their whole civilization kind of collapses. You have the collapse of the civilization in southern India. The Old Kingdom in Egypt collapses. There's these convulsions in Europe, the Middle East. Northeast Asia was no exception either. You have the kind of ancestors of the Navajo people. They go and they get annihilated by the spread of the Yukagirs and the Eskimos, who kind of build this far northern empire. And it's not really an empire in the sense that they're states or anything. It's just these intensely xenophobic bands that kind of organize these genocidal military campaigns, and they shoot each other to death with arrows. The name of the specific culture, I can't even pronounce it. It's like the Imi Aka culture. It's a word in Yakut. It's, Yakut's a Turkic language. I can't really pronounce it. Anyhow, those guys, they overrun the, kind of ancestors, the Navajo, in kind of eastern Siberia, Kamchatka, that whole area. Sea River as well as the Timir Peninsula. There's a guy, Kra001. He's known as kind of the earliest, or he actually is the earliest sample we have for an Orlick, or at least a guy with a lot of Orlick ancestry. And he's very clearly admixed with these kind of Yukagir, Eskimo-like peoples who are expanding. The Nenets people of, kind of the Timir Peninsula, they're a Samoyedic group. They come in contact with them as well. And, rather than being a genocidal contact like it was kind of in northeastern Siberia and Kamchatka, Chukotka, that whole area, it looks like there's more trade. There's actually contacts that range all the way from Kamchatka in the east, in the Bering Straits, all the way to, kind of Lapland, the Sapmi in northern Scandinavia. The Sami also kind of launched their expansion at the same time, perhaps being goaded by, these fearsome Yukagir or, Eskimo warriors from the east, or, possibly, since they don't really carry any of the ancestry from them, they're just kind of like Erliks mixed with the eastern hunter-gatherer groups, as well as some other groups living in that kind of far northern land that had successfully escaped the Indo-European conquests 800 years earlier. They kind of go and overrun the Arctic Sea coast up to from the Mezen River all the way through Scandinavia, and they kind of form a trade connection too. There's like pottery and stuff that's going all the way from Korea all the way to Scandinavia. So very cool stuff. It looks like the Silk Road probably originated in the late 3rd millennium, if not earlier. There are some arguments that as early as the 5th millennium BC, that there were actually trade contacts between East Asia and northeastern Europe. There are some difficulties with that, though. One thing that we don't really see, plague, which it looks like there was a major plague maybe around 3000 BC, possibly associated with the Indo-Europeans, connecting the East Asian world with the European world. So these early kind of contacts before 3000 BC don't necessarily make a lot of sense, since you'd think they would have spread the plague then too, which might have been epidemic in what's modern day is Kyrgyzstan. It's difficult to say. So going back, to kind of Manchuria, northeastern Asia. And I forgot, the Yukagirs exterminated the woolly mammoths about 2200 BC on Frongol Island. Very sad, but the pyramids were built before the woolly mammoths were snuffed out. Just kind of a fun fact. So the Hongshan culture goes and expands, goes and kind of overruns Korea. And the Hongshan, they go and they replace considerable part of the population. And they're about, but not entirely, they're about like 80% of the Liao farmer, the Hongshan people in ancestry, and then still like 20% of the, kind of Jomon people in ancestry. And I think one of the people in Korea actually has haplogroup D, so you do see, whether it's either a hunter-gatherer resurgence, where you have these Jomon kind of fishermen go and conquer these farmers from Manchuria, or you go and you have kind of the political structure of these Jomon coastal polities are being integrated into these presumably Korean and Japanese speaking invaders from Manchuria. It's difficult to say. Some of these kind of synthetic cultures survived actually in a historical period. During the kind of Three Kingdoms period of Korea, we actually have some DNA samples of what's called the Gaia Confederacy, which I think was destroyed in the 6th century AD. And the Gaia Confederacy was actually a biracial society. You have some of these people who are basically these pure Hongshan-like farmers, and then on the other hand, you have these people who are like 80% Hongshan and 20%, of this kind of Korean type of Jomon in ancestry. Now, interestingly, that particular type of ancestry goes very well with the Yayoi ancestry, the kind of people who are believed to have introduced, Japanese to the islands of Japan. So this is very controversial for Korea, since it would imply that kind of the ancestors of the Japanese arrived in Korea first, which is something that, the Japanese ideologues in World War II were saying, that Korean only arrived later. In Korean, at least per the theory, Korean would have arrived later, as I've got to look up how to pronounce this word. It is the Xiajidian. It's Xiajadian. Do you guys know like Chinese good enough to tell me how to pronounce that? Xiajidian. I'll just call it anyhow. Those guys were the ones that most likely brought the actual Korean language to Korea. Now their roots are kind of interesting. They had a bit more Yellow River farmer in ancestry. Oh, okay. I think we've got, or never mind. Those guys actually had quite a bit more Yellow River farmer in ancestry, actually, than the kind of earlier, Hongshan people did. So they're fairly distinctive. And also, interestingly, their haplogroup, it's haplogroup O, which is what we see more in Korea and China today. Now, these specific people, they were, very heavily influenced by the steppe cultures, even though they didn't have any, ancestry from the steppe peoples themselves. They wielded bronze. They had, horse stuff. They had a kind of a pastoral economy. It wasn't, well, I guess not really a pastoral economy, but kind of a mixed agro-pastoralism, where they had a lot of farm animals. They had these metal tools. I think they had burial mounds too, which is another kind of thing the steppe tribes would do. And they had bronze, which was a really big thing. This particular group, it looks like they were, my guess, and again, I don't think there's any actual evidence for this, is that they were originally from, kind of or at least their kind of Yellow River farmer ancestry, would have originated on kind of the Ordos Loop, which is to the south of Mongolia, has a lot of exposure to the steppe since there's not really anything protecting it. There's a lot of low S soils there that always get into the Yellow River, and that's what causes the, every once in a while the silt from the Ordos Loop will build up and will cause the Yellow River to change its course and flood terribly, toppling the Chinese dynasties and everything. I think the last time it did it was the 1930s. So this particular group, maybe, 600 to 300 BC goes and invades Korea. And there's actually some Korean mythology that remembers this, where you have kind of this agricultural society is taken over by this Bronze Age society. And they kind of go and intermarry with the locals and mythologies. And, that's what it looks like here. You have this kind of influx of the, this Bronze Age group of horsemen as they go and conquer these Hongshan farmers. And eventually they go and they end up destroying these Jomon-like peoples within the historical period. So yes, not very fun for the Jomons, or really even kind of the Hongshan people that were in Korea either. So those bronze working conquerors, they eventually get ironworking, a lot more context from the West. So they get ironworking maybe about the 4th century BC. And this is also when we go and we see the Yayoi. They go and they launch their invasion from Korea to Japan, maybe about 300 BC. They conquer a lot of Japan, end up ruling it for about 600 years. They're kind of remnants at home, or most likely that Gaia Confederacy that we talked about earlier, that kind of biracial society in kind of South Central Korea. So the Yayoi are actually supplanted by another group that's descended from that group of kind of Bronze Age conquerors that most likely migrated from the Ordos Loop to southern Manchuria to Korea. And they're associated with the arrival of the Kofun period in Japan, which arrives about 300 AD. Now, it's kind of interesting that it happens specifically right around 300 AD, since the 3rd century was very much a time of crisis all over the world. You have, the crisis of the 3rd century in Rome. You have the plague of Cyprian. The Roman Empire's population collapses. I believe it's been a couple of years since I've read his book. Ward Perkins, thinks that the Roman Empire's population fell by like a third to half in the 3rd century as a result of the political chaos and, kind of the spread of the plague of Cyprian. The plague spread East Asia as well. Most likely, in my opinion, what happened is it spread to Korea and Japan. The trade routes were definitely connected. There's all sorts of stuff in East Asia from Rome and in Rome from East Asia. So this plague was going around, killing tons of people, huge numbers of people were dying. And this would have given the opportunity for kind of this, rotting Yayoi Japan to be taken over by yet another wave of invaders from Korea. And they replaced, a fair chunk of the Japanese population. The Yayoi invasion had been pretty devastating. This was even more devastating. I think, the average Japanese today is only like 20% Jomon in ancestry. And I don't even think the Jomon-like ancestry is detectable in Koreans. So very, very violent time. And, there's actually been a little bit more East Asian ancestry that's kind of trickled into Japan within the last, couple hundred years too. And it makes sense. The Japanese were very much in the Chinese political orbit at various periods, at waves of Chinese immigration. One thing that those, Woku pirates would do is they'd always be selling slaves from China to Japan and vice versa. So it makes sense that there was a lot of mixing. So further to the north, there's a lot of stuff going on in Mongolia as well. You have, there's kind of 2 waves of Iranians that arrive in the, kind of between 1500 and 500 BC. The second group of whom specifically come from modern-day Uzbekistan, that kind of area, the Amudarya River Basin. They carry a lot of ancestry that's specifically from that area with those settled societies. And those are the Sakas, the Saka. Clearly massive realm. The Romans know them. I think the Chinese have records to them as well. And they're kind of the, the steppe lords of, 1000 to 500 BC. So they go and they're actually, as they kind of collapse, the Hyongnu rise up. Hyongnu origins are kind of mysterious. We might not ever know. The Hyongnu, the massive tribal confederation, they unite steppe tribes as far away as the North Caucasus. The Alans, who are the ancestors of the modern-day Ossetians, are part of it. They have people who are clearly Mongols who are part of their steppe confederation. And they go and, as they become more and more powerful, the Chinese become more and more powerful as well. They have all these wars. Finally, before collapsing in the early ADs, there's, all sorts of successors that are feuding amongst themselves. The Uyghurs, you have, they appear, they end up conquering Xinjiang, about 1,000 years ago, or I think it might have been 1,300, I can't remember. The Uyghurs, the burials we have for them, they some of them are like pure East Asian, some of them clearly have this kind of like Central Asian, Iranian-like ancestry. I guess Tajiks would be kind of the best living example, although not like, not a perfect proxy by any means. So they're expanding the Khitans, Khitan, and again, I know I'm mispronouncing that. The only East Asian language I've any experience with at all is Korean. They're pretty much pure East Asian. And then the Mongols, of course, show up, very, very famous people. They're like 15% Alan in ancestry, the ancestors of the Ossetians. And the rest of their ancestry, is very much East Asian, some of it being Chinese, but the bulk of it being kind of this, Manchurian group. So the Mongols might have stayed living in Manchuria for a very long time and only migrated to Mongolia within the last, 1,500 years or so. And of course the Mongols, they go and had a huge effect. Their eagles were actually sourced from like the far northern mountains of Siberia. So their range was, when they kind of do the maps of the Mongol Empire, they actually kind of understate how far they reached. Since they had tributary relationships all the way up to the Pechora River and kind of northern European Russia, as well as up to like the Timir Peninsula and, like the Lena River, all those areas. So definitely like far more larger than people give them credit for. I know there was kind of a lot to cover, let's see, I'm just trying to think of any, let me check my notes again, see if there's anything I wanted to bring up. Oh yes, the Asian war complex. And so kind of the collapse of the Xiongnu actually sent some of the peoples of Mongolia like flinging all the way into kind of northeastern Siberia. And some of those people, they came in contact with the ancestors of, the Eskimo Aleut peoples, and they introduced kind of a new bow technology from East Asia. They had kind of like new fortification building techniques, all this other stuff. The peoples of the far north, even though it was a very, very marginal environment, they were definitely not dumb. They picked up on this war-making technology immediately. And it kind of set in motion this chain of events that would go on for, 700 to 800 years in the Americas, where you have, first they go and they wipe out the kind of relatives of the Navajo in the far north of Canada for the most part, even though some of them, the Athabascans, survive in the interior. There's raids in the Middle Ages as far south as the Channel Islands off the coast of Los Angeles from Alaska, amazingly. One of the Chumash burials, actually, the guy had a, grandparent who, was presumably like an Eskimo or an Aleut or something. And it's kind of the fourth spread of the bow and arrow technology into the Americas. And that's when, at least in the historical period, when, kind of the bow and arrow technology finally took off and it didn't die off like it had in the past. There's the Nadeni people. Those are the people that are, that includes the Navajo. They pick up a lot of the weaponry, fortification styles and stuff from the Eskimos and adopt those elements of the Asian war complex and use it to conquer huge amounts of territory. They most famously with the Navajo and the Apache as they go and they overcome not just kind of the decaying and decadent Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest, but also, the extremely violent and militarily capable Numic peoples, the ancestors of the famous Comanche, the Paiutes, and all of them. So all of these events that happen in East Asia that aren't necessarily, don't seem related to events in Europe or the Americas, did actually have kind of long-standing, effects. And that's kind of what I hope you guys got out of this space today. I know it was a lot of, kind of confused. Kind of just went everywhere. In retrospect, I should have probably picked a more limited thing to talk about, like Korea specifically. So I will open it up for the Q&A.